Eric stepped into the crowded auction house, still shaking off the stress of the week. He wasn't sure what had drawn him there in the first place, curiosity, boredom, or the need to clear his head. The air buzzed with anticipation as bidders shuffled their paddles, whispering among themselves, eyes scanning the stage where various items were being sold off one by one. The auctioneer's voice rang out over the murmur of the crowd, rattling off bids in a quick, rhythmic chant. Eric let his gaze drift over the collection of furniture, artwork, and miscellaneous household goods arranged for sale. The usual mix of estate leftovers, he assumed, until a familiar piece caught his eye. It was a leather couch, worn at the edges but still sturdy. A couch he had sat on for years, feet up on the coffee table, beer in hand, watching game after game. Next to it, a wooden desk, its surface scratched and dented with time. His grandfather's desk, the one he had painstakingly restored years ago. The weight of recognition sank into his chest as his eyes darted from item to item. The old oak dining table. The bookshelf filled with carefully arranged first editions. Even the stainless steel grill, the one he had spent an entire summer saving up for, stood there with a small numbered tag affixed to it. A sickening wave of disbelief washed over him. This wasn't just some estate sale. This was his home. The walls of the auction house suddenly felt smaller, the voices around him muffled under the deafening roar in his ears. His home, his things, all up for sale as if they belonged to someone else. His stomach twisted as he took a step forward, his breath unsteady, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His mind grasped for explanations. A mistake. A coincidence. But then, across the room, he saw her. Olivia. She stood near the front, blonde hair swept up in the effortless style she always claimed took no effort at all. She was wearing a deep green dress, the same color as the one she had worn on their anniversary last year. But that night, she had worn it for him. Tonight, she laughed, leaning in close to a man he didn't recognize. Eric's hands curled into fists as he watched her. There was no guilt in her posture, no hesitation in her movements. She wasn't grieving the loss of these things. She wasn't here to recover a single memory from the life they had built. She was selling it all, and she was celebrating. Her fingers brushed against the arm of the man beside her, a casual, familiar gesture. He was younger, fit, with the smug expression of someone who had won a prize he didn't earn. Olivia whispered something in his ear, and they both chuckled, oblivious to the devastation unfolding just yards away. Eric barely noticed as the auctioneer called out another bid, his focus locked onto the woman he had once trusted with everything. The betrayal felt like a knife between his ribs, twisting deeper with each passing second. He had never questioned her loyalty. The thought of Olivia being anything but faithful, anything but his partner, had never crossed his mind. Sure, they had arguments, what couple didn't? She had been distant lately, distracted, but he had assumed it was just the usual strain of life, the weight of responsibilities pressing down on them both. Now, it all made sense. The unexplained absences, the late-night phone calls she had brushed off as work emergencies, the sudden secrecy surrounding their finances. He had overlooked the warning signs, dismissed the gut instincts that had whispered something wasn't right. And now, he stood in a crowded room, watching strangers place bids on the pieces of his life, while his wife, no, the woman he had married, because his wife, the woman he had vowed to build a life with, was long gone, smiled beside another man, ready to walk away from it all. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath coming in short, controlled exhales. He had been blind. Worse, he had been a fool. The auctioneer's voice cut through his thoughts, announcing the next item, a framed wedding photograph. His wedding photograph. The black and white image of him and Olivia, standing in front of a flower-covered arch, locked in an embrace that once held meaning. The auctioneer rattled off a starting price, and someone raised a paddle. Laughter from the front of the room. His vision narrowed, the world tilting as realization settled fully into his bones. Olivia hadn't just left him. She had erased him. Eric stood frozen in the auction house, the buzz of the crowd a distant hum in his ears. His belongings, his life, were being dismantled piece by piece, each item disappearing into the hands of strangers who had no idea they were buying fragments of a stolen existence. His stomach clenched as he tried to process the scope of what had happened. It hadn't just been a betrayal of the heart. Olivia had orchestrated something much bigger, something calculated. This wasn't an impulsive affair, some fleeting mistake she had fallen into. No, this had been months, maybe years, in the making. He thought back over the past year. The late nights, the long hours he had been putting in at work, all to make sure they could maintain the lifestyle Olivia always claimed to love. The house in a good neighborhood, the luxury vacations, the fine dining on special occasions, it had all been for them, for the life they had built together. He had been so consumed with providing that he hadn't noticed how methodically she had been pulling it all out from under him. The first red flag should have been the finances. Olivia had always handled the household expenses, something he had never questioned. She had a talent for organization, always made sure the bills were paid on time. So when she had casually mentioned a few months back that she had restructured some of their accounts to simplify things, he had nodded absent-mindedly, trusting her completely. Except she hadn't simplified anything. She had moved funds, drained joint accounts, hidden assets in places he hadn't even thought to look. With each passing week, she had siphoned away their savings, transferring money into private accounts under her sole control. And the house, his house, the one he had poured his sweat and money into, had been signed away right under his nose. His name wiped from the deed, replaced with hers. She had forged his signature, made it all legal on paper. He clenched his jaw, bile rising in his throat. While he had been exhausted from long shifts, believing he was securing their future, Olivia had been meeting with lawyers, setting up new bank accounts, and laying the groundwork for her escape. And she hadn't done it alone. His gaze drifted back to the man standing beside her. Brandon. The personal trainer. Eric barely noticed him at first, just another one of Olivia's vanity projects. She had taken up personal training a year ago, something about investing in herself and feeling empowered. He had been happy for her, supportive even, glad she had found something she enjoyed. He had met Brandon once or twice, cocky, young, the type of guy who spoke in motivational slogans and flexed just a little too often. At the time, Eric had dismissed him. He had been too tired to care about Olivia's sudden interest in fitness, her new routines, her constant need to run to the gym. It had seemed harmless. It hadn't been harmless. Brandon wasn't just some passing trainer. He was part of the plan, the reason Olivia had suddenly decided their marriage wasn't enough anymore. The younger man, smooth-talking and eager, had wormed his way into Olivia's life, and into her bed. And now, standing here in the auction house, watching Olivia touch Brandon's arm as she laughed, Eric realized something chilling. They had never planned on just leaving. They had planned on replacing him. He forced himself to breathe, to stay rooted where he was as rage clawed at his chest. But then, just as he thought he had seen the worst of it, Olivia's voice cut through the auction noise, carrying with it a lie so monstrous it knocked the air from his lungs. She was speaking to the auctioneer, making conversation, smiling as if today was nothing more than a casual transaction. Her voice was smooth, her tone light, as she explained why the house was being sold. Her husband, she claimed, had died last year. A tragic accident. The world tilted. Dead. She had erased him. Not just from their home, not just from their finances, but from existence itself. In her version of events, Eric Holt no longer walked this earth. He was nothing more than a memory, a sad story to elicit sympathy while she liquidated everything he had worked for. The betrayal had layers, each one more suffocating than the last. Eric's fingers twitched at his sides. How many people had she told this to? How far had this lie traveled? Had she mourned him publicly, played the grieving widow while quietly dismantling the life they had built. The thought made his blood run cold. Brandon shifted beside Olivia, glancing at her with something like admiration. He had found himself a woman willing to rewrite history for him, to burn her past to the ground so she could build something new at Eric's expense. Eric had seen enough. His vision sharpened, the room shrinking around him until all he could see was the smug satisfaction on Olivia's face. She believed she had won. That he was gone, powerless to stop what she had set in motion. But she was wrong. Eric was very much alive. And he was about to remind her exactly who she had tried to erase. Eric's pulse steadied as he watched Olivia smile, unaware of the storm she had summoned. The weight of betrayal had settled into something colder, something sharper. He had been wrong about many things, about their marriage, about her loyalty, but one thing Olivia had underestimated was him. She thought she had won. She thought she had erased him. But Eric had seen the cracks in the foundation long before today. For months, something had felt off. It had started small, late-night phone calls she'd dismiss as work-related, quick hangs-ups when he walked into the room. Unexplained expenses on their credit card statements, charges from places Olivia never mentioned. Expensive restaurants, out-of-state hotel stays, luxury purchases that had no place in their household budget. She had an explanation for everything. A friend's birthday dinner. A business trip. A misplaced charge she'd take care of. And each time, Eric had accepted her words at face value. Until he stopped. The shift had been gradual, but undeniable. Olivia had become more secretive, more distant. She had always taken pride in their home, fussing over decor, making plans for renovations. Then suddenly, she stopped caring. Pieces of furniture began disappearing, and when he asked about it, she would wave it off, just decluttering. But the house hadn't been getting emptier. Olivia had been preparing for an exit. Eric had spent weeks trying to convince himself it was all in his head, that he was overanalyzing. But suspicion has a way of festering. And eventually, it had pushed him to act. He hadn't confronted her. Not yet. Instead, he had done something smarter. He had hired a lawyer. The first meeting had been surreal, sitting in a sleek office with a man who spoke in measured, careful words, already laying out possibilities that Eric hadn't fully considered yet. Divorce. Asset division. Hidden funds. Fraud. The lawyer had nodded knowingly as Eric laid out his concerns, as if he had seen this 100 times before. And then, the work had begun. What Olivia didn't realize was that every lie she told, every secret she thought she had buried, was being unearthed. The bank statements had been the first revelation. Olivia had opened new accounts in her name alone, diverting money from their joint savings. Transactions that lined up perfectly with her sudden love for weekend self-improvement retreats that, as it turned out, involved no improvement whatsoever. Then, the phone records. Late-night calls to one number, over and over again. Brandon. The text messages had been even worse. Stolen moments of laughter, plans for the future, casual mentions of Eric like he was nothing more than a stepping stone to be discarded. And worse, Olivia boasting to a friend about how easy it had been to set things in motion. About how she was going to leave that idiot with nothing. Eric had read those words more times than he cared to admit, each one carving deeper into his ribs. But what sealed everything was the recording. He hadn't set out to capture it. It had been dumb luck, Olivia on the phone, pacing the kitchen while he was in the next room, his own phone on the counter, recording an unrelated work memo. He had forgotten about it for days, only to stumble across it later, playing it back absent-mindedly, until he heard her voice. She had been laughing, giddy. Talking about the house. About the money. About how she and Brandon would be long gone before Eric even knew what hit him. And that had been it. The moment the betrayal became real in a way that was impossible to ignore. That was when Eric had stopped being the fool she had taken him for. Now, standing in the auction house, he reached into his jacket, fingers brushing against the folder tucked inside. Every document, every text, every financial record, it was all there, neatly compiled, ready to be unleashed. He had let her play her game. Let her build her web of lies, so confident that she had already won. But Olivia had no idea that she had walked straight into his trap. And now, it was time to spring it. Eric stood at the back of the auction house, watching the scene unfold with a quiet, simmering patience. The betrayal still burned in his chest, but now it was accompanied by something else, anticipation. Olivia had no idea she was walking straight into a disaster of her own making. She stood at the front, her posture relaxed, exuding the confidence of a woman who believed she had just secured her future. She kept glancing at Brandon, who leaned in close, whispering something in her ear that made her giggle. They looked like two people celebrating a victory, unaware that the ground beneath them was about to collapse. One by one, Eric's belongings disappeared into the hands of strangers. The couch where he had spent Sunday afternoons watching football, the grill he had painstakingly assembled piece by piece, the antique desk his grandfather had left him. All gone. Each sale lined Olivia's pockets, her satisfaction growing with every bid called out. She handled the auctioneer's paperwork with a businesslike efficiency, as if none of it had ever belonged to someone else. As if the life she had built with Eric was nothing more than a pile of things to be sold off to the highest bidder. He let her revel in it. Let her taste the victory she thought she had won. Then the final item was announced, the house itself. The crowd shifted with interest. This was the main event, the real prize. A home in an upscale neighborhood, completely paid off, a rare find in the market. The bidding started aggressively, paddles shooting up one after another. Olivia's expression was one of pure delight as she stood at the center of it all, soaking in the excitement. The numbers climbed quickly. Each new bid brought her closer to a windfall that would fund her fresh start, far away from the husband she had so carefully discarded. And then, as the bidding neared its peak, a single, anonymous bid came in, higher than all the rest. Silence fell over the room as the auctioneer called for any further offers. The crowd hesitated. It was a bold bid, one that left little room for counteroffers. When no one else raised their paddle, the gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. Sold. To the gentleman in the back. Heads turned, searching for the winner. And then, slowly, deliberately, Eric stepped forward. The moment Olivia saw him, her smirk disappeared. Her fingers tightened around the check she had been holding, her entire body going rigid. Brandon, beside her, frowned in confusion, his gaze darting between her and the man she had thought was long gone. Eric didn't rush. He let the moment stretch, let Olivia's mind race through the implications of what had just happened. He could see the calculations behind her wide eyes, the way her expression shifted from shock to disbelief, and finally, to panic. She had thought she was selling him out of his own life. She had thought she was walking away with everything. And now, she was realizing she had just handed it all back to him. He reached into his jacket, pulling out the folder that held every shred of evidence against her, bank statements, forged documents, recorded conversations. Proof of her fraud, her deception, her attempt to rewrite history. She had set the fire. And he had just let her burn in it. Eric held the papers up, making sure she saw them. The color drained from her face. She had no words now, no clever manipulation to spin the situation in her favor. Not this time. She had sold everything. And he had bought it back. The house, the assets, every single thing she had stolen, he had just taken it all from her, legally, cleanly, without giving her a dime she could walk away with. Her fortune had turned to ashes in an instant. Brandon shifted beside her, his confidence faltering as he realized the woman he had attached himself to was no longer holding the golden ticket she had promised. Eric turned, walking toward the exit, leaving Olivia frozen in the wreckage of her own scheme. As he stepped outside, the evening air felt lighter. The weight of betrayal still lingered, but the sting had dulled. He had lost something today, yes. But Olivia had lost everything. Olivia's world crumbled in an instant. The gavel's final crack still echoed through the auction house, but the weight of what had just happened was settling fast. Her fingers twitched around the check in her hand, a check that, just moments ago, had been her ticket to a brand new life. But now, it was worthless. The house was gone, but not to some faceless buyer she could forget about. It belonged to Eric again. The realization hit her in waves, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally, cold, consuming dread. Everything had unraveled so quickly. The money she had counted on, the fresh start she had meticulously planned, had been yanked out from under her. The transactions she had so carefully hidden had been exposed, every forged document, every transfer, every lie she had told. The auction should have been her moment of triumph, the final nail in the coffin of her old life. Instead, it had become a trap, one she had walked into with a smile on her face. She turned to Brandon, expecting reassurance, but he had already taken a step back. His usual smug confidence had vanished, replaced with the dawning realization that the woman he had latched onto was no longer a guaranteed meal ticket. He had signed up for luxury, for an easy life funded by someone else's husband, not this. Olivia could see it in his expression, he was calculating his exit. And then, without a word, he made his decision. Brandon walked away. No confrontation, no dramatic outburst. Just a swift, silent retreat. He didn't even look back. The man she had risked everything for, the one she had rewritten her entire life around, had left without hesitation the moment things stopped going his way. Her throat tightened. The betrayal stung, but deep down, she knew she couldn't even blame him. She had built her world on deception, and now, it was collapsing exactly the way she had constructed it, cold, ruthless, and without a trace of remorse. And then came the final blow. Security approached, firm and professional, informing her that she needed to leave. The house no longer belonged to her. She had no claim, no rights, nothing left to fight for. The sale was final, and she was no longer welcome. Eric didn't need to say a word. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or revel in her downfall. He simply walked past her, up the steps of the house she had tried to take from him, and disappeared inside, shutting the door behind him. That, somehow, was worse than any insult he could have thrown at her. The street felt colder as she stood there, watching the door that was no longer hers. She had imagined walking away from this place with money in her pocket and a new life ahead of her. Instead, she stood on the sidewalk with nothing. No money. No house. No future. The people around her barely paid attention as they filtered out of the auction house, already moving on, already forgetting. The realization settled deep in her chest. She hadn't just lost the house. She had lost everything. And as she took a slow, uncertain step forward, heading down the street with nowhere to go, she finally understood the weight of what she had done. Eric didn't just take back his house. He took back his dignity. His peace. His freedom. And the worst part? She knew, without a doubt, that she would never find a way to replace what she had lost.